There are many places around the world that we commonly associate with volcanoes and volcanic activity, but there are some that aren't as familiar to most of us, and one of those places is actually Australia. And one of the ways that we can learn about the volcanic activity and the history of volcanism here is actually through integrating indigenous local knowledge with physical science. And so I'm very excited to bring on today to talk about this and a number of things, Associate Professor Heather Handley, all the way from Australia, joining us from Sydney. Hi there, Heather.
Hi, Sam. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Thank you so much for joining us today. There's a fantastic range of things we're able to talk about today, and I'm really excited to hear about some of the things you've got upcoming, some of your past work, but it'd be great to hear just a little bit more about yourself, how you've got to where you are today, and then some of the current things you're working on.
Yeah, when I was 5 years old, really, I think my geological curiosity started. I'm originally from South Yorkshire in the UK, and we used to go fossil hunting with my parents on the Jurassic Yorkshire coastline. Yeah, and it was there that I discovered my love of finding fossils. And so, yeah, I think that's where it all started for me. And then again, through family, really, on a holiday to Tenerife, the island of Tenerife, when I was 9 years old. You know, we took away from the beaches, hired a car and explored the island. And that's when I got to see my first active volcano. And I was just absolutely mesmerized by this giant mountain that was capable of so much, power and destruction that was sat so quietly in front of us, and this moonlight landscape of lava flows sat in front of me. And so I think it was that made me think, how do these things work? How does the earth work? And start to think, how do you turn a living animal into a piece of rock? When I was little, and it started to really spark my interest. And then from there, at school, we never, I think like many, we didn't offer geology for us to study. So, but I knew I liked physical geography and I liked physical chemistry. And so I thought geology might be something that I would find interesting. And at uni in Edinburgh, I went to do actually physical geography with geology. But as soon as I got into geology, I knew that was 100% for me. And I guess that's where it, never stopped since then. But I never really set out to be a scientist or follow a science career. But after the degree, I saw a PhD advertised for the geochemistry of Indonesian volcanoes. And I'd spent quite a bit of time in Southeast Asia while I was an undergraduate, traveling around doing humanitarian projects. And I really loved the region. And I'd liked the physical, the chemistry aspects of geology. So this just sounded like the most amazing PhD. And I was lucky to be offered it. And then from there, I carried on in geochemistry, and I moved to Australia in 2007 to do more research on volcanoes in the kind of Asia Pacific region. And then I've kind of, like, my career then probably took a little bit of a turn, and I've gone a bit more into the social sciences side of volcanoes, and really more about the human impacts and the human interaction with volcanoes. And so I started off very much a kind of hard rock geochemist, but I've ended up now kind of moving a bit more towards people's interaction and impact and resilience.
Fantastic. And so what did you know about Australia's history of volcanism before you moved out there?
Yeah, I knew very little, so I have to admit. So I was very much more interested in, the areas around Australia. We're actually surrounded by, Indonesia, Vanuatu, Tonga, New Zealand. We've got lots of volcanically active areas right around the kind of north and eastern side of Australia, and hadn't really paid attention. I was very much interested in very active volcanoes that are visibly doing something. But then I slowly started to get interested and wonder a bit more about this. So when you think about Australia, you think about, koalas, dusty red landscapes, beaches, kangaroos, but you wouldn't necessarily think about volcanoes. But in Australia, actually, we've got one of the longest continental volcanic belts in the world. It's over 4,000 kilometers long, stretching down the east coast of Australia. So we've got a very rich volcanic history. And then it started to really ignite my curiosity to learn a bit more about, why do we have volcanoes in this middle of a tectonic plate, in Australia, and what was going on like recently? Why were some so recently active?
Yes, how recent is the volcanic activity actually on the mainland?
So the last volcanic eruptions on the mainland of Australia are thought to be between around 5,000 to 7,000 years old. So this is in the southeast of the country. So we've got a volcanic field. So this is an area of, it's not like a typical volcano that you think of as a big, pointy, conical volcano. These are volcanic fields. So they're lots of little volcanoes in a big, wide region of activity. And the field, the New Volcanic Province in Southeast Australia, stretches from Melbourne all the way across the border. So that's in Victoria, all the way across the border into South Australia at Mount Gambier. And it's at Mount Gambier, they think the last volcanic eruption was about 5,000 years ago. And then in the northeast of the country, we have a volcano that was originally dated, by different techniques, older techniques of potassium argon, to be about 50,000 years old. But more recent dating by argon-argon methods has shown that volcano is possibly 7,000 years plus or minus 2. So that puts these volcanoes, these two, both in the northeast of the country and the southeast of the country, in this framework of what we really consider to be active. It was an eruption within the last 10,000 years. So there is potential in the future. Some of these fields, the New Volcanics Province has been active for over 4.5 million years. So, the last eruption was only 5,000 years ago. Why is it going to stop now that we're just more aware of the volcanic landscapes around us? So there is potential in future for future volcanic activity.
Wow, that's quite a significant change in the conception of, how recent the activity is, from dating at 50,000 back all the way down to just 7,000 years ago, and also in terms of human history.
Yes, exactly. So if we think there are different estimates for how long humans have been on the continent of Australia, and so present estimates suggest anywhere between 50,000 and 65,000 years that humans first made it across onto the continent. And so in that time frame, from the dates we have available, and we don't have all the dates, and some are really kind of estimates still, but from the dates that we have so far, there's probably been at least 13 volcanoes that were possibly witnessed by humans that have erupted in Australia over that time frame.
Wow. So so some of the work you're doing is actually trying to integrate that knowledge into either, well, by the sounds of it, quite sparse physical science records. So what have we been able to learn through, incorporating like this local indigenous history? Is it well recorded?
Yes. Well, so we're very, Australia has one of the longest lived cultures with rich traditional knowledge systems. But obviously, unfortunately, when it was colonized, there was a lot of displacement and dislocation. And as a result, there was a lot of loss of that cultural knowledge. So we are more limited in scope, and obviously some groups would not have wanted to pass that on to, missionaries or pastoralists, people that were there that actually recorded these kind of information in early, in the 19th century, in the 1800s, when I guess people arrived from Europe into Australia. So we've lost a lot of the information, but we do still have information that's been passed down. These are our best eyewitness accounts of volcanic eruptions on the mainland. These are people that, that culturally were there when they witnessed these and have passed that knowledge on for hundreds of generations because it was important, obviously. These were events that could cause harm and so, that were dangerous. And so it was very important for survival to pass that knowledge on down through generations. And so it became embedded in oral traditions. And so, one thing that I'm really interested in doing is working to integrate, just widen our broader sources of knowledge of volcanoes and the impacts on people in the environment. And in Australia, one of the ways we can do that is by integrating with knowledge of past. If we take them as eyewitness accounts, obviously there's many generations down that things may have changed a little bit, along the way from different influences. But what we can find from that is there are situations where we don't have great dates. So, for example, in Mount Gambier and Mount Shank in the New Volcanic Province, they're very close to each other, these two volcanoes. They're thought to have, we don't necessarily have a good time frame, but they're the youngest ones, so somewhere around 5,000 years ago. But we don't know which one came first. But the local Aboriginal people there have an oral tradition that talks about making ovens. So first of all, they made it in an older volcano, Mount Muirhead, and then, the evil spirit came and basically the volcano erupted. So they moved their oven and their camp to Mount Shank. And then there, the evil spirit came, the bird shrieked, which is the bullin, and then they moved their ovens to Mount Gambier. So by taking the information in the oral tradition, that can suggest that there's a relative timing, of events, that activity moved from Mount Shank to then Mount Gambier. which we can't necessarily ascertain from the scientific information available. We have some paleomagnetic information that shows the eruptions were probably about 300 years apart, but we don't know in which way they were apart. So that's one way that oral traditions can, give information. And the other way is through, the information that's provided in the events. So in northeast Queensland, there's an explosive Mar volcano that occurred there somewhere probably around 13, 18,000 years ago. And what we have there is an oral tradition that tells the story of the eruption, the events that happened and how it caught people by surprise, and they basically were fatally, wounded or injured or died from this event. And so what we can gather from that is that the warning times between the eruption, that happened, we've got, messages about the sky going a different color, about the ground, about the, things that have happened. And they interpreted that into their own, beliefs and understanding at the time. But the messages are still there about the volcanic events. And so we know there that the people had very little warning of the eruption that was coming, because the people and the village and the camp fell into the volcano. So, and people were lost. So there's a lot of really rich stories of volcanic activity in the past, and we can decipher from that, with our, I guess, I am a native English speaking Western trained scientist, so I have my own, biases or interpretation of these traditions. But we can still gather a lot of information from these traditions and combine that with the scientific knowledge to really improve our understanding of these volcanic systems and their impacts on people and the environment.
Wow, there's so much to unpack in all of this. And one of the things that's really jumped out to me there, as you say, is the importance of just such small observations, but such important observations, and one of those being warning times, particularly because it's not something that we normally preserve even in the historical record, is, the lead up time and the warnings to eruptions, whether that's swarms of earthquakes, changes in the ground activity. We can monitor those things now amazingly with satellite data and ground-based instruments. But when we go back through the geologic record for past eruptions, we rarely capture that information apart from maybe in crystal chemistry and sometimes. Exactly, But to have that actually recorded through thousands of years of oral tradition is just incredible and so useful for thinking about potential further hazards.
It is, and what I'm trying to do also is those kind of more crystal histories and that kind of mineralogical study. So part of the work I've been doing with a postdoctoral researcher is looking at ascent timescales, and I have a master's student working on this as well. So a lot of the volcanoes in the Newer Volcanic province and some in the northeast carry, these fragments or chunks of the Earth mantle to the surface, literal chunks of the Earth mantle. And it's amazing to think that a volcanic system can carry pieces of the Earth's upper mantle, 30, 40 kilometers all the way to the surface. And obviously to do that, the magma has to move fast, or these heavy, dense chunks are going to settle back down. So one thing we are doing as well to kind of complement the indigenous records and then any other information we can get is to look at the ascent timescales that we can calculate from the size of this xenolith. So basically you've got to move this big heavy thing. So if you imagine dropping a pebble into a cylinder of honey or water, it's going to sink down. And that's what it would do if you dropped a xenolith in the magma. It would just sink down these, foreign fragments of mantle. So the magma has to move fast from below to keep this thing kind of floating in the magma to the surface. And so what we're doing is both from the size and what the actual physical characteristics of the xenoliths are that we find in the rocks at the surface. We're trying to work out ascent timescales, so we know how much, that translates really to a warning time, because if you're moving from 35, 40 kilometers depth to the surface in a matter of hours or days, you're not going to get much warning time, at the surface. If you think about where the earthquakes might start to occur in the more shallow levels, it's going to be moving really fast at that stage. And then the other one is, looking at the crystal histories. So in the same way that, the tree rings might tell you about the environment when a tree grew, it's the precipitation or the temperature, what the environment was like when that tree grew from the tree rings. It's the same with the volcanic crystals, and they record or their memory of, their journey to the surface. So we're trying to take a lot of different approaches to try and understand and really decipher, if something's going to happen again, what's it likely to result in? How much warning time might we get? Because to be honest, Australia doesn't really have any preparedness for volcanic eruptions, both inside or really outside. We monitor the volcanic ash from the volcanic ash for the aviation warnings, but that's really about it at the moment, at present.
As you say, just based on very recent history, there is almost the perception of there's no need to have, volcanic hazard warnings or systems in place. But by learning more about the systems that you have on the mainland and even elsewhere, it's something that's needed. So you talk about these volcanic fields, they're not obvious volcanoes that most people might perceive elsewhere around the globe. And these are usually quite sporadic. You talked about that from being the northeast all the way down to the southern part of this volcanic chain. So is there a need to really try and have as much coverage as possible of this entire volcanic terrain to learn more about all of the systems, not just the ones that are most recent, because it could potentially happen anywhere?
Yeah, I guess the longevity of some of these individual volcanic fields is vast in terms of millions of years. I think one of these volcanic fields was active over 20 million years, one in New South Wales. And so, but I think those two areas are the main areas, to look for the future. But what we don't have even in those areas is a really good understanding of the ages of all the volcanoes. So in the Newer Volcanic Province in the southeast, there's over 400 monogenetic, polygenetic-ish volcanoes. So volcanoes that are quite small and didn't have very long-lived, eruptions, kind of died out when the supply was quite short. But we've had over 400 eruptions in one single field, and we have at least 50 volcanic fields, I think, down the east coast of Australia. And I would say probably that one in the southeast and maybe one or two in the northeast would be the ones to watch. And based on, if you just imagine you've got 400 volcanoes, it's been active for, say, 4.5 million years. That gives you an average recurrence kind of time frame of about 12,500 years for an eruption. But we know volcanoes don't sit there on their timer. It's been 5,000 years since the last one. It's not going to be 7,000 years exactly till the next one. It could be longer, or it could actually be shorter. So things can happen in clusters, or there can be long periods of time in between. So we really need actually a better understanding of the ages. But, there are challenges, if you think in the tropical north of Queensland, all the rocks, it's very hard to kind of get opportunities for dating because the rocks are so weathered. And, I've been collecting samples. You cut through, with a saw the sample, and you find this tiny little bit of core in the middle that's not, being altered or weathered. And it's quite hard sometimes, to get the right samples to be able to get the accurate dates.
Yes, you say nature's almost your worst enemy when it comes to actually learning more about the natural environment.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and then even thinking about, trying to get a picture in my head of what some of these systems look like. You talked about, your experience in the Canary Islands at the beginning of this. And if you go around those islands, you see these, these cones, these perfect little volcanic cones scattered all over the place. You'll see them in Hawaii. You can see them out in Arizona. There's so many different places where you get these little, as you said, monogenetic single eruption systems everywhere. But the older you go into the systems, the more that nature takes over from weathering, erosion, plant growth, vegetation. And I imagine a lot of the systems are unrecognizable as volcanic, even to the people who live just down the road.
Yeah, so we've got, I think in Australia in that way we're very lucky because we've got some volcanoes that, look like beautiful little volcanoes, and Mount Elephant would be one of them, Mount Shank would be another in the Newer Volcanic Province, some of my favourite little volcanoes. We also have big central volcanoes. So in addition to the volcanic fields, we also have what we call these central volcanoes, based on the fact that the eruption was really coming from a central part. And a lot of these were big shield volcanoes, and that they were thought more to be related to kind of, Hawaiian style hotspot activity. But some of those, that were 20 million years old now have eroded, down to levels where we get a beautiful view into the plumbing systems of these volcanoes, the bits that are left, the more resistant to weathering, the plumbing systems are getting revealed of these through this erosion. So we've got, old, tens of million years old volcanoes that we can see into the inner workings of, but we've also got these younger volcanoes that still look like, they're scoria cones, and they're clearly scoria cones. They're only, thousands, tens of thousands of years old, so they're quite well preserved still. But what I think people, at least in the general public, they're used to seeing that typical image of a volcano, this conical, kind of Mayon or Fuji, or, these kind of very impressive, tall, stratovolcanoes. And in the new volcanic province, we have a lot of mar volcanism. So we get a lot of, just holes in the ground filled with water that just looks like lakes. And so I think that's kind of hard for some people to really see that these are a volcano, because they're used to seeing a kind of a positive feature in the landscape and not really a negative one. But that Mount Gambier one that was about 5,000 years ago was thought to be, a fairly significant eruption. So there was a study there that worked out, the volcanic explosivity index that we measure volcanoes on, which runs from, 0 to 8, where 0 would be something, easy to walk away from, like a slow-moving lava flow, and then 8 is our super volcanic eruption. And the Mount Gambier eruption was calculated or estimated to be a VEI4.
Wow,
so,
okay.
That's similar. So it was a phreatomagmatic eruption. It was where water and magma interacted and made it more explosive, similar to the Icelandic eruption in 2010 that ground planes across Europe. So these weren't, even though they were even little volcanoes, some of them still had a punch and would have made, a significant impression on the landscape and the people at the time.
Yeah, wow. It's just putting that into perspective, thinking about potentially, what can happen in the future. How do you find that this plays into, local and education outreach? I know you do a lot of science communication with the Australian communities and with schools. How do you find the public perception of volcanism? Is it something that's surprising to most people? Is it well taught, or does it have to be, taught by scientists coming in doing outreach?
Yeah, so I think that the overall general public, they're not really aware of that Australia has volcanoes, definitely not aware that we might have active volcanoes. Some of that comes through the communication that scientists are giving to the public, and the outward facing information is not, we're not on the same plane. So some scientists are saying, it's really unlikely and it's never going to happen. Others are saying, it could happen tomorrow. And so we're not on the same plane as scientists in our messaging. And I think that probably doesn't help in the terms of our outreach of, what is active, what is an active volcano even is not clearly communicated in the general public. But what we've seen is I've started working with social scientists to really find out what the public perception is about, volcanic hazards in Australia, the risk from internal and external volcanic eruptions, and just their understanding of, our preparedness. And so I've got about 283 surveys in so far. I'm hoping to get a few more yet before we close it. But what I can see from that is that only about 4% have said that Australia is well prepared for a volcanic eruption. They all recognise they're not really concerned about volcanoes or volcanic events, but they do, I think over 80% thought that Australia could be impacted by a volcano from outside Australia. So we have a really mixed understanding of, they're not really concerned about it in their everyday, and that's, quite rightly, they're more concerned about bushfires, droughts, floods, the things that Australians encounter much more frequently. But, we also have earthquakes, and there have been some significant earthquakes in recent time that have caused a lot of damage. So we had one in 89 in Newcastle. These were magnitude 5 volcanoes and then earthquakes. And then we had another one only last September last year that was, I think, a 5.6 magnitude earthquake. So we do get, they do have some exposure to, less frequent but higher risk events. But yeah, I think volcanoes are just so far from everybody's minds because they're dealing with much more frequent other natural hazards that it's not surprising really that it's not something on the agenda.
Yes, exactly. And a lot of what you do as well is incorporating this kind of citizen science approach where you're using data and thoughts and experiences from people within Australia or outside to try and improve that knowledge to almost help the public at the same time. So you've been involved recently with some work with the Tonga Geological Services, correct? In doing some citizen science to think about, is it ash collection from the Hunga Apai eruption?
Yeah, so what we tried to do after the eruption occurred in Tonga in January of this year in 2022 we wanted to try and see if we could collect some information, but we didn't want to impose upon, Tongans that were trying to go through recovery and through the trauma of experiencing, and the fear of what was going to happen with the tsunami and the ashfall. So we were trying to think about, what information we could get to better our understanding of this event, because it was quite unusual from many different aspects. And one of those was to get more information about the thicknesses of the ash and the type of the ash, get some descriptions of that before, it gets washed away by rain or in the cleanup process. And so we developed a citizen science project, so with Tongan collaborators in Australia, with volcanologists, with people who work in, risk in Australia, and with the Tongan geological services and people and the meteorological services in Tonga and Australia, to try to make a citizen science project where we get the local people of Tonga to measure the thicknesses. So we're trying to say, if you've got a ruler or something, but if not, just use a kind of a soft drink can that we know the standard size of, so we can just you can put that in the ash, take a photo, and give us some sort of textual description of the ash. So I'm not quite sure what kind of response. We've not collated the final responses yet, and the idea was to post it to social media so that it's a useful, it'd be there for everybody to use, not just for for us, for our own projects, but so that would be a resource there for everyone.
Yeah, and as you said earlier, for the people of Australia, you're situated in a part of the globe which is surrounded by quite frequent volcanic activity, and this recent eruption in Tonga is one fairly large example of that. So also from educating Australians about volcanic activity in surrounding areas such as New Zealand, Vanuatu, and in Indonesia, it probably helps for the perception for potential volcanic hazards on the mainland in Australia as well.
Yeah, it does. And I think that, the external aspects of volcanoes that from outside Australia could affect Australians is really important, both from the impacts that could be felt on Australia, but also, a lot of Australians travel overseas and are tourists in volcanically active regions and go, to sightsee to active volcanoes. And so I think having a better understanding about, if I'm going to go to see an active volcano, what should I be, which, monitoring authorities should I check in with, what should I be looking for, so I think just having a general higher sense of awareness of volcanoes and volcanic activity would be really beneficial. And the other thing is, even volcanoes in Chile have impacted Australia because of the way that the atmospheric, circulation works. So we've had situations in the past, in the 1930s, 1991, I think 2011, where ash from volcanoes, volcanic explosivity index 5 eruptions in Chile, the ash has moved over and come across Australia and affected, aviation and closed airports or cancelled flights. And so it's not only, even those ones that are closest to us that can even affect us, even those ones further away can as well.
Yeah, it really just shows about the local reach of things like that. And also thinking about that, as you were talking about earlier, about indigenous knowledge, as well as the local volcanism, is there anything about, other larger eruptions from further away that's also recorded within those traditions? Because you get situations, where extremely large eruptions are recorded in other countries on the other side of the world from, as you said there, atmospheric effects, small amounts of ashfall affecting vegetation, those sorts of things. Is that something that's also kept within this oral history?
So far in the oral traditions that I know, I've not seen records of external events that have impacted, but they have a very rich cultural history of passing on knowledge about natural hazards. So whether it's earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, meteorite impacts, all of these events have been recorded through oral traditions and passed down through generations. But there is physical evidence in Australia, so through, kind of ash that has fallen into, actually in the northeast of the country, into actually a maar. So volcanic ash from outside the country fell into a volcanic maar inside the country.
That's not helpful for scientists.
So, when you core through the volcanic maar and you look at the sedimentation, the records that are holding, this maar formed, it formed a lake, things fell on top, settled down to the bottom, and over time you build up this sedimentary record in the bottom of the maar. And so there is a study that has found, foreign pieces of ash, these cryptotephra within a maar lake in the northeast. So they think the scientists of that study thought it probably came from Papua New Guinea. But, there were so many similarities with different places in Indonesia, PNG, possibly New Zealand. It's hard to say where it came from, but it just shows that there is cases where volcanic ash, and there was, a case from Krakatoa where, people in Western Australia got rained on with ash from the Krakatoa eruption in 1883. So there are cases in the past where we do know that volcanic ash from other places has fallen, as well as affected, a kind of higher level processes in the atmosphere.
Yeah, it just shows the complexity of looking back at some of these records, even when you're right next to a volcano. Not all, looking at the ash records from that volcano, not everything you're looking at is actually from that source.
Yeah, and I think in places like, really active places like Indonesia and New Zealand, it must be a real challenge there, where you've just got multiple volcanoes erupting at different times and trying to decipher through that record, is it a change in chemistry of your own volcano you're studying, or is it, from a neighboring one that's kind of fell on top of the sequence that you're looking at?
Absolutely. And just what you said that, about the indigenous knowledge, I'm just thinking about the timescales and the number of generations that this oral history is held on to. And it's just astounding how rich and alive those records are kept just through oral tradition. Is everything through oral tradition, or is it there also, pictorial and artistic representation that's preserved as well through, say, petroglyphs or...
So they do, they do have rock art, and they do, they inscribe stones with. I've seen a lot more in the kind of, like in terms of astronomical events, and so in terms of, on the rocks, I've not seen anything referring to volcanoes recorded through other means other than the oral traditions. But they did have multiple ways, to kind of pass on that knowledge, and they also had laws in place that, to help preserve the accuracy of the information being passed on from one generation to the next. So but it's amazing that some of these were passed on for at least 200 generations, and that and that continues today.
And so is that working directly with the current indigenous communities today to basically access that information and knowledge?
Yeah, so there's different sources. Some of the sources are literate sources, but they are of their own. They have limitations because they were recorded by colonists, and these ethnographic sources were colonists that came and, may have spent, 35 years in a missionary working with Aboriginal people and learnt their customs, traditions, languages, and then recorded them. And then there's obviously ways to work with, indigenous people of the present. And so I'm collaborating with someone from there's a extremely important site down in the New Volcanic province from Bujbin volcano, and it's a cultural landscape there. It's got World Heritage status, and so working together with them to further our understanding of events as well.
Wow, fantastic! I think it's so important that we're seeing this in a number of places around the world, where there's this increasing interest to make sure we incorporate local communities and indigenous knowledge into the physical science and the local social science, so we can better build a picture of how we can, think about our history, but also going into our future and preparing society for potential future events. So it's really, really fascinating and important work, I think, that's being done in these areas.
Yeah.
Well, this has been absolutely fantastic. I've learned so much myself. I know I'm probably going to go away from this talk and start looking at all these volcanoes that you've mentioned, and I hope others do the same. Is there a place where people can then maybe look at some of your recent work or some of the projects you're working on?
Yeah, so I've got my website that details some, and we've also got, I can provide some links, to kind of 3D models of some of the volcanoes if that's helpful. So my favorite, Mount Shank, in the New Volcanic province, we've got like a 3D model. We can give you the link to for that. But I'm also writing a book on Australia's volcanoes, and so I'll be covering all of these aspects in that. So it's work in progress at the moment, but I'm hoping to finish it this year, and hopefully then it'll be out next year. So it's kind of a popular science and history. It's really telling the history of Australia through the eyes of a volcano.
Oh, well, that's just fantastic. And please let us know when that comes out, because we will absolutely share it related to this episode. So just to finish up today, through everything that you've done, is there one particular memory or experience that's really stuck in your mind from working with volcanoes over the years?
Yeah, I think it would have to be the first time that I saw Yasur volcano in Vanuatu. And I think this is a real, everybody's so impressed whenever they go to Yasur volcano on the island of Tanna in Vanuatu. We'd gone to do some work. I was actually helping a colleague do some work on waters in Ambrim. So Ambrim's another island just to the north, kind of in Vanuatu. And there's the volcano that just throws out a huge amount of sulfur dioxide, hazardous gases. It's a big plume all the time. And the locals were concerned that it would be contaminating the rainwater, because they all have drinking water that comes from rainwater catchment. And so we were there to kind of test the water. And while we were there, we said, we're so close to Yasur. Why don't we go for a day trip to Yasur? So we jumped on this tiny plane, to go down just for a day and just experience, the volcano that erupts, every 10 minutes. So it's kind of, chugging away all the time. And then every 10 minutes, there's this big boom, so you feel the earth, you feel the shock, there's a big boom and a big shower of molten rock flying out, and it's that moments when you think, oh, are we going to be okay? Are we going to be okay? Before it kind of turns over to see where the trajectory of the volcanic bombs are going to land. But there's some accommodation there, and I think it was the accommodation that was really, it's something that always stick in my mind. So quite close to the volcano at the base, there's an accommodation there, and you go in, and it was like we were sharing a dorm, and there was no glass in the windows, but there were curtains in front of the windows, and we were on these like little rickety wooden, I guess more like camping beds. But at night, you laid in bed trying to sleep, and every 10 minutes, literally, the ground shakes, the bed rocks, the boom goes, the shockwave blows the curtains.
You can hear everything because there's no windows.
Yeah. And then you can hear it like pat, 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 as all the volcanic bombs land. So I think that would have to be, one of my most memorable volcanic experiences. I'll never forget that one.
A complete sensory experience.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that with today, and thank you for joining us for this episode, Heather, and also best of luck with writing the rest of your book. I'm sure we'll all be very excited to see it when it comes out.
Thanks very much, Sam.
Thanks, Heather.